Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. You know how this works. You send us the stuff you're curious about, complex topics you want to get your head around quickly.
And we dive into the sources you give us, try to piece it all together for you.
Exactly. So today, we're wading into some recent commentary involving Donald Trump, looking at some of his thoughts on things here, and then this kind of surprising situation up in Canada.
That's right. We've got, a couple of different angles. First, his take on American politics, specifically Democrats. And then, how some things he said might have unexpectedly rippled into the Canadian election scene.
Right. So the mission for you listening, get a clearer picture of these dynamics, the arguments being made, without getting bogged down.
Just the key takeaways, really, so you feel up to speed on what these sources are saying.
Okay, so let's kick things off. First up, something that definitely caught my eye, Trump weighing in on the Washington football team.
Oh, yeah, the Commanders. He was on Truth Social, wasn't he? He was. And it wasn't just a mention. He was basically announcing they're coming back to D.C. itself.
Right, and he framed it really strongly, called it a huge win, I think, for D.C., for the fans.
Yeah, huge win. He definitely emphasized that. And he didn't stop there. He connected it to all sorts of other potential benefits.
That's classic, isn't it? Linking a specific event to broader themes. What did he suggest would happen?
Well, boosted economic development, for one, more jobs coming to the area, and even potentially lowering crime rates.
Wow, okay. So the return of a football team equals economic boom and less crime. That's optimistic.
It is. And he wrapped it all up, of course, with making Washington, D.C. great again.
Ah, there it is, the signature sign-off. It really shows how, political figures can attach huge symbolic meaning to things like this. A sports team move becomes a sign of overall renewal.
Yeah, it taps into that desire for good news, maybe. Like a symbol matters as much as the substance sometimes.
Could be. It's definitely a narrative strategy we see.
Okay, now let's shift gears quite a bit. The other main chunk of commentary we looked at gets into his analysis of Democrat politicians versus Democrat voters.
Right, and this is where he makes a really sharp distinction. It's key to his whole argument here.
What's the core difference, in his view?
Well, he argues they're driven by totally different things. The politicians, he paints them as chasing power, wealth, status. He even compares it to, like, Hollywood celebrities wanting that limelight.
So it's about being part of an elite club, that kind of thing. Less about the actual policies.
That seems to be the implication, and he follows that up by suggesting their actual policies. He lists things like, open borders, defunding police, gender-affirming surgeries for minors, high taxes. He claims these aren't actually popular when people really look at them logically.
He thinks people don't actually want those things when they're spelled out.
That's his assertion. He points to what he sees as, negative consequences or logical flaws, suggesting that objectively they wouldn't have broad support. And the implication is the politicians kind of know this.
Okay, so if the policies themselves aren't the draw, how do they win people over, according to him?
Emotion. He argues it's all about emotional manipulation, not policy substance. He gives a pretty stark example, too, related to immigration.
Oh, yeah. Oh, is that?
He uses this hypothetical line, something like politicians saying, Trump is deporting babies with cancer. His point is that language like that is designed purely to provoke, outrage and sympathy.
To bypass any rational discussion of the actual policy.
Exactly, to overshadow the details with a really strong emotional reaction.
And that leads into his idea about victim groups and boogeymen, right?
Yeah, he lays out this strategy. He lists examples of the boogeyman himself, systemic racism, climate apocalypse, patriarchal oppression. You get the idea.
Okay. And the point isn't to solve those problems.
In his view, no. The point is to create these narratives, identify these enemies, and then position Democrat politicians as the protectors of the victim groups who are supposedly threatened by these boogeymen.
So it creates loyalty, dependency.
That's the argument.
Sure.
That it's more about consolidating power by fostering this sense of grievance and us versus them, rather than finding actual solutions. It's a pretty cynical take on it.
It definitely is. But then when he talks about the voters, the Democrat voters themselves, his tone seems to shift a bit.
It does. He doesn't just lump them in with the politicians.
Yeah.
He paints a more maybe sympathetic picture, suggesting many are facing real personal challenges.
Like what kind of challenges?
Things like unstable backgrounds, maybe broken homes, absent or even abusive parents, struggles with addiction. He portrays them as people who are sort of searching.
Searching for meaning. For belonging.
Yeah, that's the idea. And he argues that maybe because they lack traditional anchors like strong faith in God or solid family or community ties, they become drawn to what he calls secular ideologies.
And what does he mean by secular ideologies?
He gives examples like climate activism, LGBTQ+ causes, transgender advocacy. He frames these as almost like false idols that fill a void for people seeking purpose.
So these causes offer identity, a community.
That's his perspective, that these movements, especially when framed as urgent moral issues, give people something to believe in, a group to belong to. He specifically mentions climate change and transgender rights as examples where this passion provides that sense of purpose.
Regardless of the policy details or debates around them.
Right. It's more about the feeling of being part of something important, something righteous. It touches on, broader ideas about identity politics and finding meaning today.
So it all comes back to the politicians exploiting these needs.
Yeah, he argues they offer these very simple, emotionally resonant narratives, good versus evil, us versus them, that appeal directly to these voters who are looking for that sense of clarity and belonging.
Even if the narratives are simplistic or maybe don't hold up.
That's his claim. And this leads to what he calls the symbiotic trap. It's a feedback loop.
Okay, explain that. Symbiotic trap.
Politicians craft these narratives to get votes. Voters, seeking purpose and community, embrace these narratives. This reinforces the politicians' power and encourages them to keep using the same tactics.
So it just keeps going, a self-perpetuating cycle based on emotion and division.
As he sees it, yeah. These manufactured crises or divisions fuel the whole system. You can maybe see parallels in how certain cultural issues get debated, right? Politicians take strong stands, energize their base, the base rallies, reinforcing that framing.
So does he offer a way out of this so-called trap?
He does. His proposed solution is pretty much a return to more traditional foundations.
Like what?
Faith, family, community, and also critical thinking. He suggests that if voters rediscovered grounding in these things, they'd be less susceptible to the emotional manipulation he describes.
So find meaning internally or in traditional structures rather than in these political movements.
Pretty much. It's a call to shift focus back to personal anchors and away from what he sees as externally imposed, politically motivated ideologies.
Okay. That's definitely a lot to unpack there regarding his view on American politics. A very distinct perspective.
It certainly is. Very detailed, very specific in its analysis of motivations.
Right. Now let's pivot because this next part is genuinely, well, surprising. We're heading north to Canada. It seems Trump's words have been making some unexpected waves up there.
Yeah, this is fascinating. The sources suggest a really noticeable shift in Canadian election polls recently. The Liberals, who were lagging behind the Conservatives earlier this year, seem to gain significant ground.
And some people are linking this, at least partly, to Trump. It's a different country's election.
I know, it sounds strange, right? But apparently he posted on Truth Social again, this time offering some, let's call it, advice to Canadian voters.
Advice? What kind of advice?
Well, he basically said they should elect a leader who would slash taxes, boost military power supposedly for free, and get this quadruple business with the U.S. with zero tariffs or taxes if Canada became the 51st state.
Slight pause. Wait, what? Become the 51st state? He actually suggested that.
He did. It was quite the statement. Not exactly subtle diplomatic language,
No kidding.
No.
Wow. So how did Canadians react? Did polling suddenly show massive support for joining the U.S.?
Not quite. What happened, according to the polling data mentioned in the sources, was a pretty stark reversal. The Conservatives had a solid lead, something like 45% to the Liberals' 11%, way back in December.
Okay, huge lead.
Yeah. But then, closer to the election, some polls showed the Liberals pulling ahead, maybe 44% to 40%. Now, polls are just snapshots, obviously, with margins of error.
But still, that's a massive swing from 11% to potentially leading. That's huge.
It really is, and analysts were pointing fingers, trying to figure out why.
And Trump's comments were part of that explanation.
It seems so.
Yeah.
One analyst, Angus Reid, called the whole situation extraordinary. Because initially, Canadians seemed pretty unhappy with the Liberals and Prime Minister Trudeau. But then Trudeau resigned, Mark Carney took over as Liberal leader.
Okay.
And this happened around the same time as Trump's inauguration and, crucially, these comments about tariffs and, well, annexation.
So it wasn't just the weird statehood offer, but the underlying threat, maybe. Tariffs. Pressure.
That seems to be the interpretation. Suddenly, Trump himself and how Canada should deal with him became a central issue in their election, almost overnight.
Which must have been an opportunity for the new Liberal leader, Carney.
Exactly. It allowed Carney to frame himself as the defender of Canadian sovereignty. the experienced international hand who could stand up to this pressure from the U.S., specifically from Trump.
So he leaned into it, made it part of his campaign.
It appears that way. He could highlight his background, former central bank governor, UN envoy, stuff like that. Although apparently he also faced criticism for maybe being a bit out of touch with regular Canadians.
And what about the conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre? How did he handle this?
Well, he was running on a change message, trying to capitalize on dissatisfaction with the Liberals' long tenure. But, opponents pointed out he'd been in Parliament for ages himself.
So it became Carney positioning himself against Trump versus Poilievre, focusing on domestic change.
Sort of. And according to another analyst, Daryl Bricker, that focus on Trump actually seemed to help the Liberals, at least for a while.
How so?
Bricker apparently observed that whenever Trump made those 51st state-type comments, it immediately shifted the debate in Canada to, how do we handle this? And on that question, Carney, with his diplomatic image, perhaps seemed like a safer bet to some voters.
Interesting. But you said for a while, did something change again?
Yeah, it seems Trump kind of stopped talking about Canada as much in the weeks right before the vote.
Okay. And what effect did that have?
Well, Bricker's analysis suggests that once Trump faded from the headlines in Canada, voters started thinking more about domestic stuff again. Things like affordability, the economy issues where the conservatives perhaps felt they had an advantage, especially given the Liberals had been in power so long.
Wow, what a roller coaster. Trump speaks, helps liberals. Trump goes quiet, helps conservatives, maybe. Sounds like it was going to be really close.
It really does. Bricker even suggested the whole election would likely come down to Ontario, specifically that key 905 region around Toronto, which has often leaned Liberal in the past.
So a real nail-biter, potentially. And regardless of who won, dealing with Trump was clearly going to be top of the agenda. Carney even said he'd meet Trump quickly if he won, right?
Yeah, to talk trade and security, it was unavoidable. But the really interesting twist, maybe, is what Angus Reid suggested.
What's that?
That Trump's whole intervention might have actually hurt the conservative candidate, Poilievre.
Hurt him? But aren't they sort of ideologically aligned in some ways? Populist, conservative?
You'd think, maybe. But Reid's take was that Poilievre didn't really capitalize on the Trump threat. He kept focusing on the carbon tax, on Trudeau's record, instead of maybe using Trump's statements to his advantage somehow or positioning himself strongly in relation to them.
Huh. So the irony is, Trump might have unintentionally damaged the chances of the Canadian politician who, on paper, might seem more like him.
That's one interpretation, yeah. It's pretty counterintuitive. It just shows how unpredictable these external influences can be. And apparently, voter engagement was super high. Record numbers voting in advance.
Suggests people were really paying attention, maybe feeling anxious about the outcome.
Absolutely. It really drives home how, global politics and local politics are just so tangled up now. Statements made in one country can have real tangible effects somewhere else, often in ways you just wouldn't predict.
Okay, so let's try and pull this all together. We've gone through Trump's detailed breakdown of Democrats, politicians versus voters, motivations, the whole manipulation argument, the symbiotic trap idea.
And his proposed fix involving faith, family, critical thinking.
Right. And then we jumped over to Canada and saw how his unique commentary might have seriously swayed polling dynamics in their election, possibly even hurting the conservative candidate.
Yeah, the big takeaways seem to be about, well, first, the sheer power of political rhetoric, how narratives are constructed, how emotion is used, both here and apparently how it can spill across borders.
And second, just how interconnected things are, how a major figure in one country can become a central issue in another country's election, totally unexpectedly.
It definitely makes you think, doesn't it, about how these big global figures and the things they say resonate locally. How much does that influence how people feel, how they vote, maybe in ways we don't even fully realize?
That's a really good question to chew on. How much do these outside forces shape our own political landscape and our own decisions? Something to keep pondering. Anyway, thanks for diving deep with us on this one.